Hello everyone, I'm JG and welcome back to Music Forever, where today we're continuing the 2020 year-end list with my top 5 favorite EPs of 2020. This was a tough list for me to put together. I mean, all my year-end lists are usually because there's lots of great stuff and I gotta fit it all into a nice concise list, and that's never easy to do, especially with so much great music out there. But this list in particular was one that I found to be especially difficult because there was a lot of great EPs from this year. Not quite enough that I could make a top 10 if I wanted to. I was just a little bit short of having like 10 great EPs, but at the same time, there was almost 10 great EPs I could have talked about, and because of that I had to make some really difficult cuts for today's list. But either way, here I am with my top 5 favorite EPs of 2020. All 5 of these EPs are really great. They're all worth checking out. And before getting into the main body of this video, I'm just going to establish some rules for this. It's the same rules as all my other lists, but I think it bears repeating in case you're new here. This is just based on my own personal opinion, so if you happen to disagree, that's a perfectly fine and valid thing. In fact, you could leave your own list of favorite EPs in the comment section down below to share with some other people some of the stuff that you thought happened to be great from this year. And it's worth noting that if your favorite EP of the year isn't on this list, for one thing, it doesn't necessarily mean that I don't like it. I could have liked it and it just didn't make the cut. Or maybe it means I just didn't even hear it and maybe I would like it if I did hear it. That's also why you should share your favorites from the year in the comment section down below so I could check out some of those great EPs you guys heard going into the new year. But aside from that, the only other important rule I have to share is that obviously to be on this list, the EP had to have been released in 2020, January 1st of 2020 to December 31st of 2020. I know it seems like a bit of an obvious statement, but I know some people do their year-end list a bit differently when it comes to what parts of the year apply to each year that they're doing their list for. But that's how I do my list here, as it's always been on the channel. So yeah, I think that really sums up all the important things I need to get out of the way before getting into the actual list itself. So with that said, let's start with my number 5 pick. JPEG Mafia has been one of my favorite rappers to follow over the past few years since I discovered him through his album Veteran in 2018, just because his style is so creative and unique and unlike anyone else in hip-hop currently. And this EP here is a project that really showcases why this is. This EP is a compilation of sorts containing a bunch of tracks he released over the course of this year. And while that might make it, technically a compilation, and you might not expect it to be like a super cohesive listen, this actually flows together in a way that's really nice and smooth. And the creativity and excellent performances on this thing make for this being just a really enjoyable listen from start to finish. Sure, it's not as grand of a statement as a project like Veteran or All My Heroes or Cornballs are, but those are full-length projects, whereas this is just a shorter EP. And I think as far as shorter-length EPs go, there's a ton of character and great performances and stuff to really love here in this EP that makes it a worthwhile listen. The instrumentals on this EP showcase JPEG Mafia's typical quirky style of production that's oftentimes glitchy, sometimes even cloudy as well. Regardless, it all sounds really great. His performances on this EP are fantastic too, whether it be his rapping, which is really passionate and engaging, or his singing, which still sounds really beautiful. It all just sounds great coming from him, and the hook work on this project is also really solid too. The lyrics on this project also showcase JPEG Mafia's typical blend of very serious subject matter and at times humor too. And it just strikes a really nice balance between these things here on this project, much like on his previous 2 albums. And I still really enjoy it on this thing too. The couple of features you get here are also pretty solid. Overall, this EP is just a super enjoyable collection of JPEG Mafia tracks. Again, I don't think it's quite as great as his previous 2 albums because it's not quite as grand in scope necessarily, but if you're looking for great JPEG Mafia content, even if you're unfamiliar with JPEG Mafia, I don't think this is necessarily a bad place to start because I think this EP really showcases a lot of what makes his music great in a nice, short, concise package. And I can't really think of too many other artists out there that are able to put both a standard version of a track and a remix version of the track on the same project, very close to each other in the track list, and have it work as nicely as it does with Bald here on this EP, because that's the kind of thing that I would think would normally be kind of annoying or redundant, but the remix version of the original Bald is so unique and interesting when compared to the original, which is already a great track to begin with, that having it appear on the project twice it still works, and it still sounds really great. So yeah, at the end of the day, EP is just a fantastic EP, one that is certainly deserving of being one of the best of 2020. Bring Me the Horizon are certainly an interesting act in rock and metal right now, because they're the kind of group that I think, based on where they initially started and the kind of music that they were initially putting out, you wouldn't really expect them to have that big of a career in a year like 2020. But these guys have managed to experiment and change things up just enough to keep themselves relevant, and with their newest EP, they've managed to create probably their best full-length project yet. Honestly, I found myself just really enjoying this project because I think this band really combined different aspects of their sound in a perfect way here on this thing. You know, I've said in previous reviews that I really liked the pop side of this group, and I didn't really care so much for the metal side of the group, but I think what I was really trying to get at, but maybe I didn't completely understand because I didn't really have the context to put two and two together, was more so that I really liked the catchiness of some of their pop material, but I oftentimes felt like some of the heavier tracks on projects like Ammo, or maybe That's the Spirit, kind of got in the way of some of these pop songs from really developing into their own thing and just being the best versions of themselves, I guess. But here on this newest project, all these tracks, for the most part, tend to be pretty heavy, but at the same time they have those big, massive, catchy hooks to them. It's like they've taken that side of them that I really liked in their pop tracks, but applied it to a metal-like sound, and it just pays off to make some of the best metal I heard this year, and some of the catchiest pop metal I've heard in recent memory. Like I said, the hooks here on this project are absolutely massive. They are incredibly catchy. They're the kind of hooks that you just want to sing along to at the top of your lungs. And all the vocal performances here on this thing are really strong too, and they really help sell a lot of these hooks. The instrumentals here on this project are really solid too. They have a kind of heavy metal-like sound to them, but they also manage to mix in some electronic elements too, creating this almost like industrial sort of tinge to them. Mick Gordon, who is best known as doing the music for the newest couple of Doom games, was responsible for some of the production on some of these tracks, and the reason I bring this up is because if you're familiar with those soundtracks and their general sound, that's kind of what a lot of the instrumentals here on this thing, even the ones that don't have this production, kind of sound like, you know, when it comes to mixing together elements of metal and electronics, but maybe in a bit more of a conventional pop package here on this thing with how these songs are structured. Bring Me the Horizon also bring with them a good amount of variety on this thing too. You know, you'll have like really aggressive moments on this thing, like the opener track. You'll have your ballad type tracks like the closer here on this thing. You'll have your more mid-tempo metal tracks as well. And some of the experimentation on this thing comes about due to the features, which are also a pretty interesting component of this project, because I feel like this band does a really good job at taking features and applying them to tracks in a way that gives the song a unique personality because of the feature, but not at the expense of the core sound of the band too. I think probably the best example of this is the track Kingslayer with Baby Metal, which ends up being one of my favorite songs in the catalogs of both of these artists, because it's a track that depends both on the core sounds of Bring Me the Horizon and Baby Metal, and it combines these sounds in a way unlike anything in either band's discography, but at the same time it really just comes together to sound fantastic. Both artists really enhance each other. They play off each other in great ways here, mixing the really aggressive metal side of this group with the catchy poppiness of a group like Baby Metal. It's just a fantastic song, easily the best songs here, one of my favorites of the year in general. Yeah, this just ends up being a super fun, catchy pop metal release. I'm honestly not even the biggest fan of the closer here on this thing, and yet, despite that fact, I still find myself coming back to this thing over and over and over again, just because all the other tracks on this thing are so great and so catchy and fun that, you know, every time I listen to this thing, I just have a great big smile on my face, because this is the kind of pop metal that is both heavy, but at the same time catchy and really fun because of it. So yeah, definitely my favorite release from Bring Me the Horizon so far. I think they have it in them to continue putting out some great material in the future, and I'm excited to see what they do, because this was a hit in my opinion. This was far from the first project that Rook dropped this year, but it's the only one that was an EP, so it's the only one making this list, but believe me, we will be talking about her again when it comes time to do my best albums of the year list, but I won't get into that too much. I don't want to spoil things too much for you guys, but this was a fantastic EP in my opinion, and one that I think has a lot of what I like from Rook as an artist, while at the same time having its own unique personality too. Conceptually, this project deals with the idea of places, more specifically unfamiliar places, and I think the tone of this record really helps sell the idea of this thing, because this whole project manages to have that, core kind of noisy indie pop sound that Rook has shown on previous releases from her, but that sound is here in addition to this almost kind of like hazy, dreamlike atmosphere on some tracks, especially like on the opener to this thing where the vocals feel almost kind of dreamlike and distorted in a way. It creates this almost nostalgic, hazy feel to much of this project, like you're reminiscing about some place that you have like memories of that are fond or something along those lines. I think it's really interesting how this thing, despite being only like 4 tracks and having a pretty short runtime, it's able to feel like it has a very concrete identity in that regard. In addition to the sound of this record being very fleshed out and having a really distinct personality to it, I think Rook's vocal performances on these tracks are really solid as well, and I think they pair up nicely with the instrumentals, and they do a great job at selling the atmosphere of this record too. The lyrics on this thing also do a really great job at conveying that general concept I was talking about before, and I just think the flow of this thing is really nice too. It makes for a nice, tight, cohesive listen if that's the kind of thing that you're looking for. So overall, this EP was one that I found myself returning to quite a lot towards the end of this year after this thing initially dropped, just because the atmosphere here on this thing is really great, the performances here are all excellent, the concept behind this thing is really interesting too. Overall, it's just a really fantastic EP, so check it out. This is the second project this year from Backwash, and it's a project that I found myself really enjoying and returning to quite a lot throughout this year ever since it first dropped. This project does a lot of what I liked in the studio album that she also dropped this year, but it takes what was on that studio album and pushes it in a slightly different direction. It still has that horrorcore sound and style of that record, but it now has a more prominent rap metal sound to it here on this thing. Not to say that that wasn't somewhat present on that album too, but it's more prominent here on this thing than it was on that album. The instrumentals here on this thing are really hard-hitting, consisting of a mixture of some original instrumentation and some Christian metal samples mixed together to create these really hard-hitting rap metal beats unlike anything else I've heard before. Backwash herself has some great performances on this thing, really powerful, really charismatic, really just interesting too overall. The hook work on this thing is really great, really catchy, whether the hooks are coming from Backwash or any of the featured artists on this thing, they're fantastic regardless. And this thing is also one that offers a good amount of variety over the course of its runtime too. You'll have your more traditional hard-hitting rap metal tracks on this thing, like the title track, but you'll also have like the closer to this thing, which isn't even a rap metal song. It's more of this instrumental interlude that ends off things on this kind of eerie note, unlike anything else on the entire EP. Overall, this is just a super engaging and interesting rap metal project. I know rap metal gets a bit of a bad rep because a lot of the bands that got popular in that scene back when it was really big weren't exactly, the greatest representation of what this genre was capable of doing, but Backwash has a really interesting approach to this style on this EP. And I think even if, rap metal has never really been your thing in the past, maybe the biggest bands in the scene never really did much for you, I think this is still worth checking out because Backwash's approach to this style is one that's very different from any other artist that I've heard. The approach to, mixing together rap and metal music here on this thing is just, it feels like it comes from a different place than lots of artists back like in the late 90s and early 2000s were coming from. And I think the end results just feel a lot more interesting, they feel a lot more fresh, a bit more hard-hitting, a lot more authentic as well. Yeah, overall, this is just a fantastic EP, one that you need to hear. And at the #1 spot on my list, my favorite EP of 2020, we have the newest from Zealand Ardor. Zealand Ardor is a band that I've always found to be one of the most interesting in metal currently, ever since I first discovered these guys, just because their blend of black metal with spirituals and R&B music is one that's unlike anything else I've heard from any other act out there. It's a very unique sound, and one that this band just manages to execute excellently with every project, it seems. And this newest EP here is no exception to that. The overall sound of this record is one that shouldn't be too unfamiliar to fans of this band's previous work, because it contains a lot of these same genre mixtures that I mentioned before. However, it never feels redundant or dull or anything like that, because the band, not only is this a super unique sound that they're playing with, but they're also making some very interesting compositions here on this thing. The way that they're mixing some of these genres here on these tracks, and the way that they choose to focus some tracks on a particular sound while doing things completely differently on another one, and then sequencing the tracks in the order that they've been sequenced in here, it makes for a super engaging listen, and one that feels like a very cohesive experience. I love it when EPs feel almost like mini albums in a sense, rather than just like a collection of loose songs, because I tend to be an album person. I love cohesive big pieces of music, and this here is a perfect example of why. But while the instrumentals here on this thing are super unique and super interesting and just all around fantastic, the thing that elevates this EP from being one that's great in my eyes to, EP of the year, is really the lyrics and themes here on this project. Zealand Ardor as a group have always dealt with themes of black empowerment and racism, things along those lines. And here on this newest EP from the band, they're tackling these same issues, but with a bit more of a specific focus, that being lyrics inspired by the murder of George Floyd and the resulting Black Lives Matter protests that followed in 2020. We got plenty of releases and songs in 2020 about this stuff. A lot of it was really good, but this stood out to me, this whole EP stood out to me as one of the best pieces of music to really tackle this subject matter. I think the opening track to this EP, Vigil, really demonstrates the emotional power of the lyrics here on this project. It's a track that, whereas, many opening songs to a project start out with a lot of energy or something really catchy to hook in the audience, this track goes for a little bit of a different approach in order to provide some sort of big opening to the project. It's more of an emotional gut punch than anything else, because the instrumental here is one of the sparsest on the entire EP. It's slower, it does have a bit of a build-up as it goes along, but it's the kind of instrumental that really allows for the vocals and therefore the lyrics to take the forefront of things. And the lyrics here on this track are just, in a sense, devastating. They're really heavy when it comes to the weight of what is being discussed here. There's a lot of sadness in the lyrics of this track, but I can't help but feel like there's a little bit of hope mixed in there as well, especially when they're talking about not taking things quietly going forward. It's one of those things that's not super hopeful or anything like that. I'm not sure that this is a happy song by any stretch of the imagination, but there's certainly a will to carry on present in the song, despite a lot of the sadness and tragedy that is on display in the lyrics of this track. And it's one of those songs that is certainly hard to listen to at points, just because of how heavy the subject matter is, but it's one that's important to listen to, and it's one that I think is one of the most potent songs of the year, because of how well written the lyrics here are. And when it comes to the other tracks on this EP, the lyrics are also really strong. They're able to get across their message really nicely too, for similar reasons. And the end result that you get here with this EP is a project that just feels really well written, really well performed, and super interesting too. And when it comes to the lyrics particularly, it feels like a really striking piece of music, maybe in part because metal on the whole didn't have a ton of projects talking about this stuff in 2020, but I think also because this band does a really great job at balancing, having lyrics that have, maybe more objective content to them when it comes to what's going on in them. But there's also a lot of emotional content in there too. They're not just saying stuff that is important on like a surface level. There's an emotional reaction that you'll get listening to tracks like these, just because you could feel a lot of the sadness and the anger and the desperation, at times maybe even a little bit of hope too, while listening to tracks like these. So with all that said, Wake of a Nation just ends up being a really powerful, concise collection of tracks. again, it's one of the year's most interesting releases for sure, regardless of format. Just because this is an EP doesn't mean that you should not, check it out, or it should be lower on your list of priorities or anything like that. This is a project that you need to check out as soon as possible, especially if you're a fan of these guys and if you're a fan of this kind of music, or any of the genres really that this band experiments with, because there's a lot to love here on this EP. And yeah, that sums up all my thoughts on Wake of a Nation and why it's my favorite EP of 2020. And that also sums up my entire list. But yeah, that was all my thoughts when it came to the best releases as far as EPs go in 2020. Like I said before, it's just my own personal opinion. And all of these EPs are really worth checking out. While I did rank them based on how much I enjoyed them, the difference in quality between like number 5 and number 1 isn't really all that significant. I think these are all worth checking out, especially if they sound interesting to you. And if you want to know what some of my honorable mentions were, like some of those projects that I wish I could have included on a list like this, but I just couldn't with the 5 EP limit, I have a list on my Rate Your Music account, which is going to be linked in the description down below, where I rank out all the EPs I heard in 2020. It's something I do every year for my EPs and albums. And basically in there you could see what EPs just fell short of making the list. And a lot of those are still very much worth checking out. I've included little descriptions in there too, explaining why. So if you want to know my honorable mentions and what are some other EPs from this year that are worth checking out, check out that list that, once again, is linked in the description down below, because, hey, that's just more good music for you to hear, and that's a list that's going to continue to be updated going forward like I do with all my other lists from years past. As time goes on, I keep updating those to reflect my current opinions and things like that. So depending on when you're watching this video, it may not be exactly the same as the top 5 I'm discussing here, but my guess is there might be more good EPs mixed in there as well, in addition to these 5 I've talked about here today. So that's a good thing too, I guess, as I check out some more good EPs from this year. So yeah, I think that really sums up everything I had to talk about in this video. Again, thank you guys for watching. Make sure you comment down below your favorite EPs of 2020. Leave a like on the video as well, and make sure you subscribe so you don't miss out on more music-related content in the future. Like I said at the very start of this video, we're in the middle of my 2020 year-end list. I've already put out my worst list, but soon to come is going to be my best albums list and my best songs list. So if you want to know what was some more good music from this year, definitely stick around to check out those lists. Again, thank you guys for watching, and stay golden.